The morning of October 12, 1943, began like every other morning at the Gestapo headquarters on Szucha Avenue in Warsaw. Irena Sendler adjusted her nurse's armband, straightened the papers in her leather satchel, and walked through the iron gates past guards who barely glanced at her identification. She had made this walk dozens of times. The guards recognized her, a social worker, a nurse from the health department, someone concerned with typhus outbreaks in the Jewish ghetto, someone harmless. Inside her satchel, beneath the official health department documents stamped with Nazi approval, were the names and new identities of 6 Jewish children. By nightfall, if everything went according to plan, those children would be sleeping in Catholic orphanages or with Polish families who had agreed to hide them. Their parents, if still alive behind the ghetto walls, would never see them again. But they would be alive. That was what mattered. Sendler was 29 years old. Before the war, she had worked for the Social Welfare Department in Warsaw, processing applications for public assistance, visiting families in poverty, filing reports, bureaucratic work, the kind of work that made people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties when asked what she did for a living. Social work, health inspections, paperwork, nothing glamorous, nothing that suggested she would become one of the most effective resistance operatives in occupied Poland. The Germans had noticed her only because she was useful. When typhus broke out in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941, the Nazi administration needed Polish social workers who could enter the sealed district, assess the health crisis, and report back. Typhus was a threat that crossed walls. If an epidemic raged unchecked among the Jews, it could spread to the Aryan side of the city, infecting German soldiers and Polish workers whose labor the Reich required. So the health department received passes. Official, documentation. Permission to enter the ghetto. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sendler had volunteered for the ghetto assignments immediately. Her supervisor had been surprised. Most social workers avoided the ghetto duty. It meant exposure to disease, long hours in miserable conditions, and the psychological burden of witnessing suffering you could do little to alleviate. But Sendler had insisted. She needed access to the ghetto, not to count typhus cases, though she did that too, maintaining her cover with meticulous reports. She needed access because she had already decided what she was going to do. The decision had not been sudden. It had formed gradually, through a series of small realizations that accumulated until action became inevitable. She had grown up in Otwock, a small town near Warsaw, where her father, a physician, had treated Jewish and Catholic patients without distinction. He had died when she was 7, from typhus contracted while treating patients too poor to afford other doctors. The Jewish community had mourned him. She remembered their faces at his funeral. She remembered their respect for a man who had seen them as human beings deserving of care. When the Germans occupied Warsaw in September 1939, Sendler had been working for the Social Welfare Department for 2 years. She watched as Jewish colleagues lost their positions. She watched as families she had helped before the war were forced into an ever-shrinking district of the city. She watched as the walls went up in November 1940, brick by brick, sealing off approximately 140,000 Jews in an area of roughly 1.3 square miles. The population would eventually swell to over 400,000 as Jews from surrounding areas were forced into the ghetto. The density became unbearable, 7 to 8 people per room. Starvation rations, disease spreading through overcrowded buildings where sanitation systems had collapsed. She had stood outside those walls in the early days, watching German guards patrol the perimeter, and understood that she was watching people being slowly murdered through deliberate neglect. The Germans called it a quarantine, a public health measure, but the death rate inside the ghetto told the truth. By the summer of 1941, approximately 5,000 people were dying each month from starvation and disease. That was when Sendler made her decision. She would use her position, her access, her bureaucratic credentials to get people out. The Warsaw Ghetto was not an improvised prison. It was a carefully designed instrument of destruction, implemented with German administrative precision. The process began almost immediately after occupation. In October 1939, Governor-General Hans Frank issued orders requiring all Jews in the general government territory to wear white armbands with blue stars of David. This made identification simple. Registration followed. Every Jew had to report to authorities, providing names, addresses, occupations, and family information. The data was compiled in registries that would later facilitate deportations. In November 1940, the Germans sealed the ghetto. The boundaries followed existing streets, creating an irregular shape that encompassed the poorest sections of Warsaw. The perimeter stretched approximately 11 miles. The wall itself varied in construction. In some places, it was brick, 3 meters high, topped with broken glass embedded in concrete. In other sections, it was wooden fencing or existing buildings whose windows and doors were bricked shut. Guards manned the gates. Poles needed special passes to enter on official business. Jews could not leave under any circumstances without authorization, which was rarely granted. The ideology behind the ghetto system was explicit in German planning documents. Jews were considered disease carriers, economic parasites, and racial enemies. Ghettos served multiple purposes in Nazi strategy. They concentrated Jewish populations in defined areas where they could be monitored and controlled. They isolated Jews from the Polish population, preventing what the Germans called racial contamination. They facilitated economic exploitation, as ghetto workshops produced goods for the German war effort using forced labor. And they created conditions where high death rates would reduce the Jewish population without requiring direct killing, at least initially. The German administration established a Jewish council, the Judenrat, to manage internal ghetto affairs. The council was responsible for distributing food rations, organizing housing, maintaining order, and eventually compiling lists of people for deportation. The system forced Jews to administer their own oppression, creating moral compromises that would haunt survivors for decades. Council members had to decide who received the inadequate food supplies, who was assigned to labor battalions, and later, who would be sent to Treblinka. Official rations for Jews in the ghetto were set at approximately 184 calories per day. This was starvation level, deliberately calculated to weaken the population. For comparison, German civilians received approximately 2,300 calories per day, and German soldiers received approximately 3,000. The ration consisted primarily of bread, potatoes, and occasionally sugar or margarine. No meat, no fresh vegetables, minimal protein. Smuggling became essential for survival. Food was brought into the ghetto through gaps in the walls, through sewers, and through bribed guards. Children were often the smugglers, small enough to slip through holes in the wall or under fences. If caught, they were shot. German policy was clear. Anyone attempting to leave or enter the ghetto without authorization would be executed. The order was posted throughout the ghetto and enforced regularly. Bodies of shot smugglers, including children, were left lying near the walls as warnings. Disease followed inevitably from overcrowding and malnutrition. Typhus, spread by lice, became epidemic. The bacteria Rickettsia prowazekii thrives in conditions where people live in close quarters without adequate hygiene. Symptoms include high fever, headache, and a characteristic rash. Without treatment, mortality rates reach 20% or higher. In the ghetto, where weakened immune systems and lack of medical supplies were common, the death rate was much higher. The German administration used the typhus epidemic as justification for maintaining the ghetto's isolation. Propaganda posters warned Polish civilians that Jews carried disease. The message was clear. The walls protected Poles from infection. This was a lie designed to manufacture consent for the ghetto system among the occupied Polish population. The real purpose of the walls was not public health, but extermination through attrition. By the time Irena Sendler began her rescue operations in earnest in 1942, the Germans had refined their administrative control of the ghetto to brutal efficiency. The health department office where she worked, located on the Aryan side of Warsaw, had been issuing epidemic control passes since the typhus outbreak began. These passes, stamped with official Nazi seals and signed by German health officials, allowed Polish medical personnel to enter the ghetto for inspections, to distribute disinfectant, and to monitor disease trends. The passes were bureaucratic instruments, part of the German obsession with documentation and procedure. Every pass listed the bearer's name, their official position, the specific purpose of entry, and the authorized date. Guards at the ghetto gates were instructed to check these documents carefully, comparing signatures against authorization lists, verifying that the stated purpose matched the items being carried into the ghetto. The system was designed to be comprehensive and difficult to circumvent, but bureaucratic systems, no matter how comprehensive, operate through human beings, and human beings have limitations. Guards became bored, checking the same documents repeatedly. They learned to recognize familiar faces, social workers and nurses who entered regularly on authorized business. They developed routines, patterns of checking that could be predicted and exploited. They were also, despite German ideology about Aryan superiority, susceptible to ordinary human frailties, including fatigue, distraction, and in some cases, corruption. Sendler studied these patterns carefully. She observed which guards were most meticulous, which ones barely glanced at papers, which ones could be approached with small bribes. She noted the times when guard shifts changed, when supervision was minimal, when chaos at the gates created opportunities. She learned that carrying medical equipment, boxes labeled with warnings about infectious material, or documents stamped with enough official-looking seals could intimidate guards into cursory inspections rather than thorough searches. The German administration had established specific protocols for handling children in the ghetto. Orphans, of which there were thousands after disease and starvation killed parents, were housed in overcrowded institutions run by the Judenrat. The conditions were horrific. Children slept on bare floors, 3 or 4 to a thin mattress. Food was scarce. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Mortality rates among ghetto children were devastating. In 1941, approximately 90,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto. A significant percentage were children under 10 years old. Jewish organizations inside the ghetto, particularly orphanages run by educators like Janusz Korczak, worked desperately to care for children. But resources were impossibly limited. Korczak, a renowned children's author and pedagogue before the war, ran an orphanage at Krok-Malna Street. He maintained routines, education, and dignity for the children in his care, even as conditions deteriorated. His staff included teachers, nurses, and volunteers who understood they were fighting a losing battle against starvation and disease, but continued anyway, because the alternative was abandoning the children to complete despair. Sendler had met Korczak during her early ghetto visits. He had been cautious at first, suspicious of anyone connected to the German administration, even indirectly through the health department. But she had proven herself through small acts. She brought extra food, hidden in her medical bags. She carried messages between families separated by the ghetto walls. She provided information about conditions on the Aryan side, news the Germans censored inside the ghetto. Gradually, Korczak and others began to trust her. Trust was the foundation of everything that followed. Without trust from Jewish families and organizations inside the ghetto, Sendler's rescue operation would have been impossible. Parents had to believe that giving their children to a Polish stranger was safer than keeping them in the ghetto. They had to believe she would not simply abandon the children, or worse, turn them over to the Germans for rewards the Nazis offered for information about Jews hiding on the Aryan side. The psychological burden of that trust was immense. Parents were being asked to make an impossible choice: keep their children and watch them starve or die of disease, or give them to strangers and never see them again. Many parents refused. They could not bring themselves to surrender their children, even when intellectually they understood the ghetto was a death trap. The emotional cost of separation was too high. But some parents made the other choice. They kissed their children goodbye, memorized their faces, and watched as Sendler and her network smuggled them out of the ghetto to uncertain futures on the Aryan side. These parents understood they were likely sending their children to safety at the cost of never being reunited. Most of those parents would die in the ghetto or in Treblinka. Their children would survive with new names, new identities, new families who would raise them as Catholics. The mechanics of smuggling children out of the Warsaw ghetto required solving multiple problems simultaneously: physical extraction from the ghetto, documentation for life on the Aryan side, and permanent placement with families or institutions willing to hide Jewish children at risk of their own lives. Sendler and her network, which eventually included approximately 25 Polish co-conspirators, developed methods that exploited every available weakness in the German system. The simplest method involved the ambulance. Sendler's health department credentials authorized her to coordinate ambulance transport for contagious cases requiring isolation outside the ghetto. The Germans, terrified of typhus spreading to their own personnel, had established protocols allowing removal of extremely ill patients to quarantine facilities. Sendler began using ambulances to carry more than just the sick. Children were sedated with small doses of medication to keep them quiet, then hidden in the ambulance among genuine medical equipment and supplies. The driver, Jan Dobrzyński, was part of Sendler's network. He knew the guards, maintained friendly relationships, and, crucially, carried documents certifying he was transporting infectious cases. Guards rarely inspected ambulances thoroughly, unwilling to risk exposure to disease. Another method exploited the courthouse that straddled the ghetto boundary. The building had entrances on both the Aryan and Jewish sides. Certain rooms technically existed in both zones. Sendler and her colleagues would bring children into Sendlerpsef, these rooms from the ghetto side, then escort them out through the Aryan entrance moments later. The operation required precise timing and cooperation from Polish court employees who looked the other way or actively assisted. One court clerk, a man whose name Sendler protected for decades after the war, would create false paperwork showing the children had legitimate business in the building. Should any German official question their presence, the sewers provided another route. Warsaw's sewer system, built in the late 19th century, connected the ghetto to the rest of the city through underground tunnels. The Germans knew about these connections and patrolled them, but the system was too extensive for complete coverage. Sendler's network included sewer workers who knew the routes, the safe passages, and the timing of German patrols. Children were led through waist-deep water in darkness, sometimes for hundreds of meters, emerging through manholes on the Aryan side, where network members waited. The children emerged filthy, terrified, and traumatized, but alive. The most dangerous method involved the gates themselves. Sendler would carry children out in her medical bag, infants small enough to fit, sedated to prevent crying. She carried them in wooden boxes labeled as medical supplies or typhus specimens, knowing guards would be reluctant to inspect containers marked as biohazardous. She carried older children, drugged to appear unconscious on stretchers alongside actual sick patients, betting that guards would not examine bodies too closely. Each child who left the ghetto needed documentation to survive on the Aryan side. Poland, under German occupation, was a surveillance state where papers were checked constantly. Random document inspections occurred on trams, in parks, at train stations. Anyone without proper identification was arrested, questioned, and if identified as Jewish, executed or deported. Sendler's network included forgers who produced false birth certificates, baptismal records, and identity cards. These documents had to be nearly perfect. They had to match official formats, use appropriate paper stock, and include stamps and signatures that could withstand scrutiny. The forgers worked from templates acquired through contacts in churches, municipal offices, and underground printing operations. They studied German inspection techniques, learning which security features mattered most. Birth certificates needed specific stamps from registrar offices. Baptismal certificates required signatures from actual priests, which meant recruiting clergy willing to falsify records. Identity cards, called kenkarte, had to include photographs, physical descriptions, and validation stamps. Creating convincing documents required skill, resources, and courage. The network also needed safe houses and permanent placements. Sendler maintained contact with dozens of Polish families willing to hide Jewish children. These families understood the risk. German policy was explicit. Poles caught hiding Jews would be executed along with everyone in their household. The penalty was posted publicly throughout occupied Poland. Despite this, families agreed. Some were motivated by religious conviction, Catholics who believed sheltering the innocent was a moral imperative. Others were motivated by simple human decency, unwilling to stand by while children were murdered. A few were paid, though money was scarce, and the risk far exceeded any reasonable compensation. Convents and Catholic orphanages provided institutional hiding places. Sendler worked with Mother Superior Matilda Ghetto, who ran orphanages in Warsaw and surrounding areas. Ghetto accepted Jewish children knowing it violated German racial laws. She instructed her nuns to teach the children Catholic prayers and rituals, not to convert them, but to provide cover during inspections. A Jewish child who could recite the Hail Mary and make the sign of the cross convincingly might pass as Catholic if questioned. Ghetto maintained secret records of the children's real identities, understanding that families might search for them after the war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Sendler kept her own records with obsessive detail. Every child rescued was recorded with their real name, their false identity, and their placement location. She wrote this information on thin tissue paper in tiny handwriting, then sealed the papers in glass jars. She buried the jars in her friend's garden, beneath an apple tree, believing that if she survived the war, she could use these records to reunite children with surviving family members, or at least restore their true identities. The morning of October 20th, 1943, Irena Sendler was arrested by the Gestapo. She had just returned home from a ghetto visit, exhausted from the constant tension of carrying forged documents and coordinating smuggling operations. The knock on her door came at dawn, the hour the Gestapo preferred for arrests because targets were disoriented, households were unprepared, and neighbours were less likely to witness and intervene. 3 officers entered her apartment. They were not interested in conversation. They searched methodically, pulling books from shelves, emptying drawers, checking for false compartments in furniture. They found nothing immediately incriminating. Sendler had been careful. She never kept records in her apartment. The lists of rescued children were buried safely in glass jars elsewhere. Her forged documents and underground contacts were memorized or kept at other locations with network members who would destroy evidence if necessary. But the Gestapo had not come searching blindly. Someone had informed on her. To this day, historians debate who betrayed Sendler. Some evidence suggests it was someone she had trusted in her network, possibly someone arrested earlier who gave her name under torture. Other evidence points to routine Gestapo surveillance that noticed patterns in her ghetto visits. The truth remains uncertain. What is certain is that the Gestapo knew she was involved in illegal activities related to Jews. They took her to Pawiak prison, the primary Gestapo detention facility in Warsaw. Pawiak had been a political prison before the war. Under German control, it became a place where Polish resistance members, Jews, and anyone suspected of anti-German activities were held, interrogated, tortured, and often executed. The prison held approximately 2,000 inmates at any time. Conditions were brutal. Cells designed for single occupancy held 10 or 15 people. Food consisted of watery soup and stale bread. Sanitation was minimal. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded blocks. Sendler was placed in solitary confinement initially, a standard procedure for prisoners the Gestapo considered important enough to interrogate personally. Her cell was approximately 2 meters by 3 meters, a narrow cot, a bucket for waste, no windows. The isolation was designed to break psychological resistance before interrogation began. The interrogations started the next day. German interrogators employed systematic torture, techniques refined through years of experience, suppressing resistance across occupied Europe. Sendler was beaten. Her legs and feet were broken with clubs, fractures to the bones that would leave her with permanent injuries and pain for the rest of her life. She was subjected to near drowning, held underwater until unconsciousness approached, then revived and questioned. The interrogators wanted names. They wanted to know who else was in her network. They wanted locations of hidden children. They wanted everything. Sendler gave them nothing. She endured the torture sessions, multiple times, over several days, and revealed no information that would compromise her network or endanger the children she had rescued. Later, when asked how she managed this, she said simply that she knew what would happen to the children if she talked. They would be found and killed. That knowledge made endurance possible, even necessary. The psychology of resistance under torture is complex. Studies of resistance members who survived Gestapo interrogation reveal common factors: strong ideological commitment, belief that their silence protected specific individuals they cared about, and conviction that suffering served a meaningful purpose. Sendler possessed all three. She believed deeply in the moral imperative to save children. She knew exactly which children and families would die if she revealed their locations, and she understood her suffering was the price for their survival. German interrogation doctrine, documented in surviving Gestapo manuals, assumed that sufficient physical pain would eventually break any prisoner. The Germans believed human beings had limits, thresholds beyond which resistance became impossible. They were partially correct. Most people do have breaking points, but exceptional individuals, under specific circumstances, can endure extraordinary suffering without breaking. Sendler was one of these individuals. After approximately 10 days of interrogation yielded nothing useful, the Gestapo sentenced her to execution. She was scheduled to be shot, a standard punishment for Poles convicted of helping Jews. Her name was added to the execution list. She was moved to a cell with other condemned prisoners, women who had been convicted of various crimes against the occupation, resistance activities, black market trading, sheltering Jews, distributing underground newspapers. The women in the cell knew they were going to die. Some prayed. Some wrote final messages to families, letters they hoped might somehow be delivered. Some simply sat in silence, processing the end of their lives. Sendler, her legs still broken and, infected from the torture, could barely walk. She lay on the cell floor, feverish, waiting for her name to be called. It never was. Members of Ghetto, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, an underground organization dedicated to helping Jews escape and hide, had learned of Sendler's arrest and impending execution. Ghetto had limited resources but maintained contacts throughout Warsaw, including connections to Polish prison guards and German officials susceptible to bribery. The organization pooled resources, gathered money from members, and approached intermediaries who could access Gestapo personnel. The bribe was substantial, reportedly approximately 32,000 zloty, an enormous sum in occupied Poland. The exact mechanism remains unclear, lost in the fog of clandestine wartime transactions, but the result was that Sendler's name was removed from the execution list. On the morning she was supposed to die, guards called other names. Women she had shared the cell with were taken out and shot. Sendler remained. Days later, without explanation, guards took Sendler from her cell and released her. She was dumped outside the prison gates, barely conscious, legs still broken, unable to walk without assistance. The official story, for German records, was that she had been executed. Her name appeared on death lists posted publicly by the Gestapo, warnings to other Poles about the consequences of resistance. This was deliberate. The Germans who had been bribed needed cover for her survival. If she was officially dead, no questions would be asked about why she was no longer in custody. Sendler was carried away from Pariak by resistance members who had been watching the prison, waiting to see if the bribe had worked. They took her to a safe house, where a doctor, another member of Ghetto, treated her injuries as best as possible without proper medical facilities. Her legs had been shattered. The bones were broken in multiple places, fractures that had already begun healing incorrectly. The doctor could not properly set them. He had no surgical equipment, no anesthesia beyond what could be scavenged. He did what he could, wrapping her legs in improvised splints, administering smuggled antibiotics to fight infection, and hoping she would survive. She did survive, but her legs never fully healed. For the rest of her life, nearly 65 more years, she walked with difficulty, often using a cane, experiencing chronic pain from bones that had set improperly. The physical damage from those days in Pariak was permanent, but she was alive, and crucially, her network was intact. She had protected the information the Gestapo wanted. The children she had smuggled out remained hidden. The families sheltering them remained unknown to German authorities. Her silence under torture had accomplished exactly what it needed to accomplish. Sendler could not return to her apartment. She was officially dead, but if she appeared publicly, the deception would collapse. She lived underground for the remainder of the occupation, moving between safe houses, using false identity papers, continuing her rescue work despite her injuries. Walking was agony. Climbing stairs left her exhausted. But the work continued because children were still dying in the ghetto, and she still had access, still had contacts, still had the ability to save lives. The German operation to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto began in earnest in July 1942 and continued through May 1943. Over the course of those months, approximately 300,000 Jews were deported from Warsaw to Treblinka extermination camp, where nearly all were murdered in gas chambers within hours of arrival. The ghetto that had held over 400,000 people at its peak was systematically emptied. Buildings were searched. People were dragged from hiding places and loaded onto trains. Those who resisted were shot on sight. During this period, Sendler's rescue operations became more desperate and more dangerous. The window for saving children was closing. German security at the ghetto gates intensified. Guards who had been lax before became vigilant. Random searches increased. The penalties for smuggling became even more severe, if that was possible, with public executions of anyone caught helping Jews. But the network persisted. They used every method available, exploiting every remaining gap in German security. Children were carried out in coffins during funeral processions, sedated and hidden among corpses that Germans were reluctant to inspect closely. Children were led through sewers in increasingly dangerous conditions as German patrols in the tunnels intensified. Older children, those who could pass as Catholic if properly coached, were walked out through gates using forged papers, a terrifying gambit that required the child to remain calm under direct German questioning. One particular rescue, documented in post-war testimony, involved a 6-year-old girl named Elżbieta. Her parents had both died of typhus. She was living in Korczak's orphanage, facing certain deportation when the ghetto was liquidated. Sendler arranged for the girl to be sedated and placed in a coffin during a funeral procession. The coffin was carried through the gate while guards watched. Once outside, the coffin was opened in a pre-arranged safe location. The girl woke up disoriented and terrified, but alive. She was given a new name, Teresa, and placed with a Catholic family who raised her as their own. Elżbieta, now Teresa, survived the war. She learned her real name and history only in the 1960s, when records Sendler had buried were recovered. By the time the Warsaw Ghetto uprising occurred in April 1943, a desperate last stand by Jewish resistance fighters against final liquidation, Sendler had already rescued approximately 2,500 children. The exact number remains uncertain because some records were lost, and Sendler herself, interviewed decades later, could not remember precise figures. But historians, working from the buried lists and cross-referencing with survivor testimony, estimate that at least 2,500 children survived because of her network's efforts. The psychological weight of this work was crushing. Sendler watched the ghetto being destroyed, knowing that for every child she saved, hundreds were being murdered. She attended to children who cried for parents they would never see again. She witnessed families torn apart by impossible choices. She lived with the knowledge that her decisions, about which children to prioritize, which families had the best chance of survival, were literally matters of life and death. When Warsaw was liberated by Soviet forces in January 1945, after the devastating suppression of the Warsaw Uprising and the systematic destruction of the city by retreating German forces, Irena Sendler emerged from hiding. She was 35 years old, permanently disabled from Gestapo torture, exhausted from years of underground work, and haunted by memories of children she had saved and thousands more she could not. Her first action was to recover the glass jars she had buried in her friend's garden beneath the apple tree. The jars had survived, protected by soil and glass from moisture and decay. Inside were the tissue paper lists, still legible, containing approximately 2,500 names written in Sendler's tiny, precise handwriting. Each entry included the child's real Jewish name, their assumed Catholic identity, and information about their placement with families or institutions. These lists represented the possibility of restoration, the hope that children scattered across Poland could reclaim their true identities and perhaps reunite with surviving family members. But reality proved more complicated than hope. Most parents who had surrendered their children to Sendler's network had not survived. They had died in the ghetto from starvation or disease, been shot during liquidation operations, or been murdered in Treblinka's gas chambers. Of the approximately 300,000 Jews deported from Warsaw to Treblinka between July 1942 and May 1943, fewer than 100 survived. The vast majority were killed within hours of arrival. Parents who had made the agonizing choice to give up their children to save them were almost all dead. Sendler attempted to locate the children using her lists and to inform them of their true identities. She worked with Jewish organizations that were trying to reunite families and document who had survived. But the process revealed painful complications. Many children had been very young when rescued, infants or toddlers with no memory of their Jewish parents or heritage. They had lived for years with Catholic families, been raised in the faith, attended church, participated in rituals that had become genuinely meaningful to them. Their adopted families, many of whom had risked execution to shelter these children, loved them and did not want to surrender them. Some children, when told of their Jewish origins, rejected the information. They could not integrate this new identity with the person they had become. They had memories of Catholic parents who had cared for them, not biological Jewish parents they could not remember. The psychological complexity was immense. These children had survived physically, but at the cost of losing their original identities, their families, and their heritage. Restoration was not simply a matter of revealing names. It required processing trauma, navigating conflicting loyalties, and reconstructing shattered lives. Other children wanted desperately to know who they had been. They had sensed something different about themselves, noticed that they did not quite fit, suspected there were secrets about their origins. For these children, Sendler's lists provided answers, though not always comforting ones. Learning your real name often came with learning that your entire birth family had been murdered. The truth was liberation from uncertainty, but also confirmation of devastating loss. Jewish organizations faced difficult decisions about these children. Some advocated for removing them from Catholic families and placing them in Jewish environments where they could learn their heritage. Others argued that children who had found stability and love should not be uprooted again, that they had experienced enough trauma. There was no clear right answer. Each case required individual assessment, negotiation between adopted families and Jewish organizations, and most importantly, consideration of what the child wanted when they were old enough to express a preference. Sendler herself struggled with these complications. She had saved the children's lives, but she had not been able to save their childhoods or their families or their futures as Jews. Many grew up Catholic, married Catholics, raised Catholic children, and never reconnected with Jewish heritage. This was not what their parents had intended when they surrendered them. The parents had wanted their children to survive, yes, but also to remain Jewish, to carry forward a heritage and identity that Hitler had tried to exterminate. The impossibility of fulfilling both goals simultaneously, survival and preservation of identity, became clear only after liberation. Poland, after the war, was a devastated landscape, physically and morally. Warsaw had been systematically destroyed by German forces. Approximately 85% of the city's buildings were reduced to rubble. The population, which had been approximately 1.3 million before the war, had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 people living in ruins when Soviet forces arrived. Reconstruction was a massive undertaking that would take decades. The Jewish community of Warsaw, which had numbered approximately 380,000 before the war, had been almost entirely destroyed. Only a few thousand Jews survived in hiding on the Aryan side or by escaping to Soviet territory. The ghetto area was rubble, deliberately demolished by Germans after the uprising. The synagogues were destroyed. The institutions, schools, and cultural centers that had made Warsaw one of the great centers of Jewish life in Europe were gone. What the Germans had not killed or deported, they had burned and demolished. Sendler returned to social work in the post-war period, working for municipal welfare services in Warsaw. She married, had children, and lived what appeared from outside to be an ordinary life. But she carried the weight of her wartime experiences always. She rarely spoke about the rescue operations, even to family. The reasons for her silence were complex. Post-war communist Poland was not friendly to stories that emphasized Polish heroism in saving Jews, as the regime preferred narratives focused on communist resistance against fascism. There was also survivor's guilt, the question of whether she had done enough, whether she could have saved more, whether different decisions might have led to better outcomes. For decades, Irena Sendler lived in relative obscurity. The communist government of Poland did not celebrate her wartime rescue activities. Her story did not fit neatly into official narratives about the war, which emphasized communist partisan resistance and downplayed other forms of opposition to German occupation. The regime was also increasingly anti-Semitic in the post-war period, particularly after 1968, when a government campaign forced many surviving Polish Jews to emigrate. In this environment, someone who had risked her life to save Jews was not a hero the government wanted to promote. The situation began to change in the 1980s and accelerated after the fall of communism in 1989. Historians and journalists began investigating wartime rescue operations, interviewing survivors, and reconstructing events the communist regime had suppressed or ignored. Sendler's story emerged through testimonies from people she had saved, now adults with families of their own, who remembered the woman who had smuggled them out of the ghetto as children. In 1965, Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims, recognized Sendler as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. She was invited to Israel to plant a tree at Yad Vashem and meet some of the people she had rescued. The recognition was significant, but it remained relatively unknown outside of Israel and Jewish communities. Sendler still lived in modest circumstances in Warsaw, working a regular job, dealing with chronic pain from her wartime injuries. The broader recognition came much later, driven partly by a remarkable accident of American education. In 1999, 3 high school students in Kansas, working on a National History Day project, discovered references to Irena Sendler in a magazine article. The article mentioned that she had saved approximately 2,500 Jewish children during the Holocaust. The students, who knew very little about the Holocaust or Poland, were shocked that they had never heard of someone who had accomplished something so extraordinary. They decided to research her story further. The students discovered that Sendler was still alive, living in Warsaw at age 89. They corresponded with her, conducted interviews, and eventually travelled to Poland to meet her. They wrote a play about her life called Life in a Jar, referring to the glass jars where she had buried the children's names. The play was performed hundreds of times across the United States and eventually in other countries, bringing Sendler's story to audiences who had never heard of to her. This grassroots recognition from American students created momentum that eventually forced broader acknowledgement. Polish media began covering Sendler's story. Politicians, sensing public interest, started to celebrate her as a national hero. In 2003, she received Poland's highest honor, the Order of the White Eagle. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, though she did not win. The international attention finally brought recognition that had been denied for decades. But Sendler herself remained ambivalent about the recognition. In interviews during her final years, she repeatedly emphasized that she had not acted alone. She named her collaborators in the rescue network, people who had risked their lives alongside her but received no recognition. She insisted that what she had done was not extraordinary but simply human decency, the minimum moral response to witnessing genocide. She also expressed continued grief about the children she had not been able to save, the thousands who died while she was rescuing hundreds. One statement she made in a 2007 interview captures this perspective. "I could have done more. This regret will follow me to my death." She was asked what she would want people to remember about her. Her response, "Remember the children. I was just someone who tried to help. The real story is what happened to them." The psychological burden of rescue work, documented in studies of Holocaust rescuers, includes a phenomenon researchers call rescuer guilt, the persistent feeling that one should have done more, saved more, acted sooner. This guilt persists even when the rescuer risked their own life and saved many people. It stems from the awareness of how many others died, the impossibility of saving everyone, and the arbitrary nature of who survived. Sendler exhibited classic symptoms of this psychological pattern. Despite saving approximately 2,500 children, she remained haunted by the hundreds of thousands she could not save. The people she saved, many of whom maintained contact with her over the decades, tried to help her understand the significance of her actions. They would tell her about their children and grandchildren, pointing out that these lives existed because of her courage. They calculated that her rescue of 2,500 children had led to the birth of thousands more descendants. In demographic terms, she had prevented the complete extinction of these family lines. Some survivors became prominent in their own right. Several became doctors, teachers, artists, and community leaders. They raised families, contributed to their societies, and carried forward the memory of what had been done to save them. Their existence, their children, their grandchildren, represented a victory against Hitler's genocidal plan. The regime had intended to kill every Jewish child in Europe. Each survivor was a defeat of that intention. Sendler died in Warsaw on May 12, 2008, at age 98. Her death was reported internationally. Leaders from Poland, Israel, and other nations issued statements honoring her memory. Thousands attended her funeral. The Polish government announced that 2008 would be designated the year of Irena Sendler. Schools, streets, and institutions were named after her. She had lived long enough to see her story recognized, though whether that recognition brought her peace remains uncertain. The story of Irena Sendler and the children she rescued from the Warsaw Ghetto represents something larger than individual heroism. It reveals the mechanics of how ordinary people resist totalitarian systems, the moral choices available even under occupation, and the long-term consequences of decisions made in moments of crisis. Understanding her story requires examining not just what she did, but why it was possible and what it meant for everyone involved. The Germans occupied Poland with extraordinary brutality, implementing policies designed to destroy Polish culture and exterminate Polish Jews. The occupation was not simply military control but systematic destruction, carried out through administrative precision and overwhelming violence. Resistance required finding spaces within this system where individual action could make a difference. Sendler found those spaces in bureaucratic procedures, in gaps between German ideology and practical enforcement, in the simple fact that guards became complacent and systems became predictable. Her success depended on collaboration. The rescue network included social workers, doctors, forgers, priests, nuns, families, sewer workers, ambulance drivers, and many others whose names remain unknown. Some were motivated by political ideology, members of leftist or nationalist resistance movements who opposed German occupation. Others were motivated by religious conviction, Catholics who believed their faith required protecting the innocent. Still others were motivated by friendship, relationships with Jews formed before the war that continued despite German attempts to sever all connections between Jews and Poles. This collaborative nature is essential to understanding Holocaust rescue. Popular narratives often focus on individual heroes, but effective rescue required networks of people performing specialized roles. Someone had to forge documents. Someone had to provide safe houses. Someone had to move children physically from danger to safety. Someone had to maintain those children once hidden. No individual could perform all these functions alone. Sendler coordinated the network, but her effectiveness depended on dozens of others who shared the risk. The risk was real and lethal. German policy explicitly stated that Poles caught helping Jews would be executed along with their entire family. This policy was enforced consistently. Frank, the Governor-General, issued orders throughout the occupation, reiterating penalties for helping Jews. Public executions served as warnings. Bodies were displayed with signs explaining their crimes. The message was unmistakable. Helping Jews meant death. Despite this, thousands of Poles chose to help. Current research suggests that between 30,000 and 60,000 Polish Jews survived the Holocaust by hiding with non-Jewish Poles. Some estimates go higher. Each hidden Jew typically required help from multiple people, suggesting that tens of thousands of Poles participated in rescue efforts at various levels. This was the largest rescue effort of Jews during the Holocaust, larger than more famous operations like the Kindertransport or the Danish Rescue, though it remains less known internationally. The question of why people risked their lives to save others has occupied researchers for decades. Studies of Holocaust rescuers identify several common factors: childhood exposure to people different from themselves, leading to seeing outsiders as individuals rather than categories; family values, emphasizing helping those in need; identification with victims based on seeing their suffering as unjust; and crucially, a belief that action was possible, that the situation was not hopeless. Sendler possessed all these characteristics. Her father's example, treating Jewish patients with respect and dying from disease contracted while helping the poor, established a moral framework. Her pre-war social work brought her into contact with Jewish families, creating relationships that made their suffering personal rather than abstract. Her position in the health department provided access and authority that made rescue operations technically feasible. And her personality, documented by people who knew her, included determination and practicality that translated moral conviction into concrete action. But individual characteristics alone do not explain rescue. Structural factors mattered enormously. Warsaw's large Jewish population and urban density provided opportunities for hiding that would not exist in rural areas. The city's sewer system, courthouse layout, and ghetto boundaries created physical possibilities for smuggling. The Polish underground's organization and resources enabled forging documents and finding safe houses. The Catholic Church's institutional structure, despite official church hierarchy often failing to oppose the Holocaust vocally, included individual clergy who acted on moral conviction to hide children. The children who survived faced lifelong consequences of their rescue. Psychological research on hidden children reveals patterns of trauma, including survivor guilt, identity confusion, difficulties forming attachments, and persistent anxiety. Many struggled with feeling they did not fully belong anywhere, neither in Jewish communities because they had been raised Catholic, nor in Catholic communities once their Jewish origins became known. Some embraced their Jewish identity as adults, learning Hebrew, moving to Israel, raising Jewish families. Others remained in the Catholic faith that had protected them, viewing it as their authentic identity regardless of biological origins. The complexity of these outcomes challenges simple narratives about rescue. Sendler saved lives, but she could not prevent psychological damage. The children survived but lost their families, their languages, their cultures, and in many cases, their names. They lived but often carried trauma that affected their entire lives and relationships. This does not diminish the value of what Sendler did. It contextualizes it, acknowledging that rescue under such circumstances involved impossible choices and permanent costs. The broader significance of Sendler's story lies in what it reveals about human behavior under totalitarian systems. The Germans created administrative structures designed to make resistance difficult and collaboration easy. They offered rewards for informing on Jews. They threatened death for helping Jews. They established surveillance systems to detect violations. They cultivated informants throughout occupied territories. Yet despite all this, people like Sendler chose resistance. They found ways to subvert the system, to exploit its weaknesses, to act according to moral conviction rather than state power. This pattern repeated across occupied Europe. In France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Italy, Individuals and networks rescued Jews despite German occupation and despite significant risks. The numbers varied by country, influenced by factors including occupation severity, local anti-Semitism levels, geographic factors, and strength of resistance movements. But everywhere, some people chose to help. Their existence disproves the claim that resistance was impossible, that ordinary people had no choice but to comply with genocidal policies. Sendler's story also illuminates what rescue required practically. It was not enough to want to help. Effective rescue required access, resources, planning, networks, and sustained effort over months or years. It required solving logistical problems, where to hide people, how to feed them, how to create false documents, how to move them to safety. It required managing risk, deciding when to act and when to wait, when to trust someone and when to refuse. It required enduring psychological stress, living with fear of discovery, watching people die while saving others, making choices that haunted rescuers for the rest of their lives. The morning of October 12, 1943, when this account began, Irena Sendler walked through the gates of Gestapo headquarters, carrying names of 6 children in her leather satchel. The guards saw a social worker, a nurse, someone concerned with disease prevention. They saw someone harmless. They were wrong. She was a member of a resistance network that would rescue approximately 2,500 children before the war ended. She was someone who would endure Gestapo torture without revealing information that would have led to mass death. She was someone whose actions would echo through generations, creating thousands of lives that would not otherwise exist. The guards saw only what they expected to see: a woman in a nurse's uniform, carrying medical papers, performing routine duties. They missed what was actually happening because the truth was too large to fit their understanding. A single person, using bureaucratic access and moral courage, was undermining the systematic murder of an entire people. One child at a time, hidden in ambulances and carried through sewers and documented with forged papers, Sendler and her network created survival where the German state had ordained death. That gap between what the guards saw and what was actually occurring represents the space where resistance happens under totalitarian rule, the space between official procedure and human implementation, the space between what the system demands and what individuals choose to do, the space where moral conviction becomes action despite overwhelming risk. Sendler found that space and worked within it, joined by dozens of others who made the same choice, saving lives that the regime had designated for extinction. They called her just a waitress, just a social worker, just a nurse, someone insignificant, someone harmless, someone who could be ignored. They were wrong about all of it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.